The afternoon of September 20th, 1944, near Arracourt, France. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams watched through his periscope as two companies from his 37th Tank Battalion found themselves outflanked by a superior German armoured force. Panthers and Mark Fours were closing from the northeast, their long-barreled 75mm guns already traversing toward his Shermans. The tactical situation was deteriorating by the second. Every manual, every training directive, every piece of doctrine Abrams had studied at Fort Knox said the same thing. When engaged by enemy armour, halt your vehicle, acquire your target, fire. The gyrostabilizer in his Sherman's turret was meant to help crews aim faster when they stopped, not to enable firing while rolling across French farmland at 20 miles per hour. That's what the instructors taught. That's what the technical manuals specified. Stop, aim, shoot. But Abrams didn't stop. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. He jammed his cigar between his teeth, barked orders into the radio, and drove his command tank straight at the German formation. His gunner tracked targets through the sight, while the Sherman bucked over uneven ground. The stabilizer whined as it fought to keep the gun aligned. At 800 yards, still moving, Abrams gave the fire command. The 75mm gun roared. The Sherman's suspension absorbed the recoil. Through the smoke and dust, Abrams saw the lead Panther stagger, then erupt in flames. His tank never stopped rolling. Behind him, the rest of his battalion followed his example, Shermans advancing in a moving gun line, firing on the move, striking with such unexpected ferocity that the German formation broke apart in confusion. The after-action report would credit Abrams with routing a superior enemy force and capturing valuable ground. What it wouldn't mention was that he'd violated nearly every principle of armoured warfare doctrine to achieve that victory. But the results were undeniable, and over the following months, other tank commanders across Europe would begin asking the same dangerous question. What if everything we'd been taught about tank gunnery was wrong? The American M4 Sherman entered combat in North Africa during October of 1942, equipped with a feature almost no other tank in the world possessed: a gyroscopic stabilizer for the main gun. The system, developed by Westinghouse and refined through several iterations, used a spinning gyroscope to detect when the gun barrel moved up or down as the tank traversed rough terrain. Hydraulic actuators would automatically adjust the gun's elevation to compensate, theoretically keeping the weapon aimed at the same point in space regardless of what the tank's hull was doing. The engineering was sophisticated for its era. The stabilizer could maintain gun alignment through pitching motion as the Sherman climbed hills or dropped into depressions. It functioned at speeds up to 10 miles per hour on reasonably level ground. In theory, this gave American tank crews a decisive advantage: the ability to engage targets immediately upon stopping without waiting for the gun to settle. But the system came with explicit limitations built into its design philosophy. The stabilizer operated in the vertical plane only, correcting for pitch but not for yaw or roll. It was intended as an aiming aid, not a fire control system. Army technical manuals were clear on this point. The gyrostabilizer's purpose was to keep the gun approximately on target during movement, so that when the tank halted, the gunner could make final adjustments and fire quickly. The assumption embedded in every training document was that accurate fire required a stationary firing platform. This assumption wasn't arbitrary. It reflected decades of artillery experience translated into armoured warfare doctrine. Traditional field guns achieved accuracy through stable firing positions, careful laying of the piece, and mathematical calculations accounting for range, elevation, and wind. When those principles transferred to tanks, the resulting doctrine emphasized positional gunnery. Tanks were mobile gun platforms that moved to favorable positions, then stopped to engage targets effectively. The peacetime training that most Sherman crews received reinforced this approach. At armored schools across the United States, instructors taught a methodical engagement sequence: identify threat, maneuver to position, halt vehicle, acquire target through sight, make final elevation and traverse adjustments. Fire. The stabilizer featured in this training as a time-saving device. With the gun already roughly aimed when you stopped, you could shoot faster than an enemy tank whose gun had to be manually elevated from a rest position. Some crews learned to use the stabilizer more actively. They'd engage it while moving, letting it keep the gun aimed at a general target area. When they halted, they'd be nearly on target already, saving crucial seconds in a gun duel. This was considered proper use of the technology. Firing while actually moving was mentioned in training only as something to avoid except in the most desperate circumstances. The reasoning seemed sound. A moving tank subjected its gun to constant motion in multiple axes. Even with the stabilizer compensating for vertical movement, there were lateral forces from turning, vibrations from the engine and tracks, and the general instability of a 30-ton vehicle crossing agricultural land. Hitting a target under those conditions seemed mathematically improbable. Better to use the Sherman's mobility to reach a good firing position, then use its stabilizer to shoot quickly from a halt. This doctrine worked adequately in North Africa, where engagement ranges often exceeded 1,000 yards, and both sides typically fought from relatively static positions. American tank commanders would maneuver their Shermans to hull-down positions, halt, and exchange. Fire with German armor at ranges where the first tank to achieve a hit usually won the engagement. The stabilizer's ability to reduce halt to fire time from 8 seconds to perhaps 4 seconds provided a genuine advantage. But North Africa's open terrain and long sight lines didn't represent the conditions American armor would face everywhere. The bocage country of Normandy in summer 1944 presented a completely different tactical environment. Ancient hedgerows divided the landscape into small fields connected by sunken roads. Engagement ranges collapsed from 1,000 yards to 300 yards or less. Tank battles became close-range ambushes, where the first tank to fire often determined the outcome. In these conditions, the traditional doctrine started producing unacceptable casualties. German tank destroyers and dug-in Panthers would wait in concealment until American Shermans maneuvered to what appeared to be good firing positions. The American tanks would halt, begin their aiming sequence, and in those few seconds of immobility, German gunners would fire. The Sherman's advantage in halt-to-fire time meant nothing if the enemy shot first from a prepared position. Third Army tank battalions suffered heavy losses in the hedgerows. Company commanders noticed a disturbing pattern. Tanks that stopped to engage were being destroyed at significantly higher rates than tanks that kept moving. The German anti-tank doctrine was optimized for engaging stationary or slow-moving targets. Their gunners were trained to wait for American tanks to halt, then fire immediately. A moving target was harder to track, harder to range, harder to hit, but American doctrine demanded that tanks halt before firing effectively. The tactical problem was straightforward. If you stopped to aim, you became an easy target. If you kept moving, you couldn't hit anything. The stabilizer was supposed to bridge this gap, but American crews had been trained to use it only as pre-aiming aid, not as an actual fire control system. Most gunners switched the stabilizer off when they halted, reverting to manual gun laying for the final shot. Using it while moving was considered wasteful of ammunition and unlikely to achieve hits. Staff officers at Third Army headquarters began analyzing tank engagement data in July 1944. The statistics were troubling. American tank battalions were achieving kill ratios against German armor, but at a cost of 3 to 4 Shermans lost for every Panther or Tiger destroyed. Part of this disparity came from the German guns' superior armor penetration, but a significant portion came from tactical doctrine. American tanks were being hit while stationary, during the brief window when they'd halted to aim. The data showed something else, though. The relatively rare instances when Sherman crews fired while moving and actually hit their targets produced dramatically different engagement outcomes. German crews, trained to expect stationary targets, were slower to respond to fire coming from moving platforms. Even if the first shot from a moving Sherman missed, it forced the German crew into a defensive reaction, disrupting their own engagement sequence. But firing on the move wasn't something American tank crews practiced. Most units explicitly discouraged it. Battalion commanders worried about ammunition expenditure. Gunnery instructors insisted that hits from moving tanks were statistical anomalies, lucky shots that couldn't be replicated. The stabilizer could keep the gun aimed in the general direction of a target while moving, but general direction didn't win battles. Precision did. And precision required a stationary platform. This thinking dominated American armor doctrine through the summer of 1944. Then certain aggressive tank commanders began conducting unauthorized experiments. Men like Creighton Abrams, who'd concluded that the old doctrine was killing his tank crews faster than German guns were, started trying something different. They started firing on the move, not as a desperate measure, but as a deliberate tactic. The technical capabilities had been there all along. The Sherman stabilizer, when properly maintained and operated, could keep the gun aimed at a target while the tank moved at speeds up to 15 or even 20 miles per hour on decent terrain. The hydraulic actuators were powerful enough to compensate for most vertical displacement. The gun sight was mechanically linked to the gun tube, so the gunner saw what the gun saw. What hadn't existed was a tactical framework for using these capabilities offensively. The equipment could do something the doctrine said was impossible, and that gap between technical reality and tactical doctrine was costing American lives. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams wasn't the first tank commander to fire on the move, but he was among the first to do it deliberately and repeatedly as a primary tactic rather than a desperate expedient. His battalion had been in continuous combat since July, pushing through the breakout from Normandy and across France. He'd lost tanks, he'd lost men, and he'd developed strong opinions about which tactical methods kept crews alive and which ones got them killed. Abrams had noticed something about the Sherman stabilizer that most crews overlooked. When the system was properly adjusted, it didn't just keep the gun pointed in approximately the right direction. It kept the gun pointed exactly where the gunner aimed it, compensating automatically for pitch and vibration. The limitation wasn't the technology. The limitation was the gunner's ability to track a moving target, while the tank was itself moving. But that limitation was trainable. Gunners could learn to lead targets, to compensate for lateral motion, to judge range while moving. It required different skills than stationary gunnery, but those skills could be developed through practice. The challenge was convincing crews that firing on the move was something other than a waste of ammunition. The engagement near Arracourt on September 20th proved the concept under the worst possible conditions. 2 of Abrams' tank companies were outflanked and about to be destroyed. Standard doctrine would have called for them to find hull-down positions, halt, and attempt to engage the superior German force from cover. But there was no time for that. The Germans were already in firing positions. Stopping meant dying, so Abrams attacked instead. He led his command tank directly at the German formation, firing on the move, and ordered his battalion to follow. The result violated every expectation German tank commanders had about American tactics. Shermans advancing in a moving gun line, shooting while rolling forward, was something outside their tactical framework. German crews hesitated, uncertain how to respond to targets that weren't behaving according to American doctrine. That hesitation lasted perhaps 15 seconds. In tank combat, 15 seconds is an eternity. Abrams's Shermans covered 200 yards in that time, closed the range, forced the German tanks to traverse their turrets to track multiple moving targets. The stabilized Sherman guns maintained rough aim throughout. Not every shot hit, but enough did to throw the German formation into confusion. The Panthers that survived the initial volley began pulling back. This was also outside their doctrine. German armor in defensive positions was supposed to stay in position, using superior guns and armor to defeat American attacks. But the moving gun line tactic changed the tactical calculus. The Germans were taking fire from multiple angles, from targets moving in ways that disrupted standard engagement procedures. Withdrawing to reset the engagement seemed like the correct response, but Abrams didn't give them time to reset. His Shermans kept advancing, kept firing, kept presenting German gunners with a complex gunnery problem that required tracking and leading multiple moving targets simultaneously. By the time the Germans attempted to establish a new firing line, Abrams' battalion had closed to ranges where the Sherman's 75mm gun became genuinely effective. The engagement ended with the German force routed, substantial enemy equipment captured, and American control of the tactical position secured. The after-action report Abrams filed was factual, but didn't emphasize the doctrinal heresy that had won the engagement. He reported enemy dispositions, friendly casualties, enemy losses, ground gained. He mentioned that his tanks had engaged while advancing. But he didn't frame this as revolutionary. He presented it as battlefield necessity, which in his mind it was. What Abrams did do was talk to other battalion commanders. Third Army's armoured divisions were concentrated in eastern France during September, preparing for the push toward the German frontier. Battalion and company commanders shared experiences, compared notes on what worked and what got men killed. Abrams' successful engagement near Arracourt became known among this informal network of combat leaders. Other commanders began experimenting cautiously. The results were inconsistent at first. Some crews achieved remarkable success firing on the move. Others wasted ammunition without scoring hits. The difference came down to several factors that weren't immediately obvious. Proper stabilizer maintenance, gunner skill at tracking moving targets, tank commander judgment about when to shoot versus when to close range, and most importantly, understanding what the stabilizer actually could and couldn't do. The stabilizer compensated for vertical movement, which meant it was most effective when the tank moved across relatively level ground. On slopes or severely uneven terrain, the system struggled. Crews learned to read the ground ahead, choosing routes that minimized vertical displacement. Good tank. Commanders became adept at finding paths that let their gunners maintain stable sight pictures even while moving. Range estimation while moving required different techniques than stationary gunnery. Traditional methods involved comparing target size to reticle markings in the gun sight, which worked fine when both tank and target were stationary. But when your own tank was moving, the geometry changed constantly. Experienced gunners developed an intuitive feel for range based on target angular velocity, how fast the target appeared to drift across their sight picture. This skill took time to develop and couldn't be taught from a manual. The other critical factor was ammunition selection. Sherman crews typically loaded a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds. For moving gunnery, high-explosive proved more forgiving. The bursting radius meant near misses could still achieve suppressive effects, forcing enemy crews to button up and disrupting their aim. Armor-piercing rounds required direct hits to be effective, which was harder to achieve from a moving platform. Tank companies that successfully adopted moving gunnery tactics tended to share certain characteristics. They maintained their stabilizers properly, treating the system as mission-critical equipment rather than a convenience. They trained their gunners extensively on tracking moving targets and estimating leads. They picked their terrain carefully, using roads and firm ground when possible. And critically, they adjusted their tactical thinking to prioritize movement over position. This last element represented the fundamental doctrinal shift. Traditional American tank doctrine derived from artillery principles: maneuver to position, establish a stable firing platform, deliver accurate fire. Moving gunnery doctrine inverted this: maintain movement as the primary defensive measure, deliver suppressive fire while maneuvering, achieve hits through volume of fire at closer ranges. The distinction wasn't subtle. It required tank commanders to think differently about every aspect of an engagement. In positional gunnery, you picked the best hull-down location and fought from there. In moving gunnery, you picked the best avenue of approach and fought while advancing along it. The terrain analysis shifted from "where can I shoot from" to "where can I move while shooting." By October 1944, certain Third Army tank battalions had become remarkably proficient at this new approach. The 4th Armored Division, which included Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, led the way. Their operations reports showed engagement patterns that differed markedly from other units. They closed to shorter ranges faster, expended more ammunition per engagement, but achieved better kill ratios and suffered fewer losses. General George Patton noticed. Patton had commanded armoured forces since the North African campaign and understood tank warfare at a level most infantry generals didn't. When his staff briefed him on 4th Armoured's tactics and casualty rates, he recognized immediately what was happening. Some of his tank commanders had discovered how to use the Sherman's stabilizer as it was actually capable of being used, rather than how doctrine said it should be used. Patton's response was characteristically direct. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He didn't issue formal orders changing doctrine. Instead, he circulated the 4th Armored Division's after-action reports to other division commanders with pointed questions about why their units weren't achieving similar results. This indirect pressure was more effective than any formal directive. Division commanders didn't want to explain to Patton why they were getting worse results than 4th Armored. They started asking their battalion commanders hard questions. The doctrine began spreading through 3rd Army during the autumn of 1944, but it remained largely informal and undocumented. Official training materials didn't change. The technical manuals still specified that the stabilizer was an aiming aid for stationary gunnery. But combat units increasingly operated according to different principles that were passed from experienced crews to replacements through demonstration and practical instruction. This created an unusual situation where official doctrine and actual practice diverged significantly. New tank crews arriving from training schools in the United States had been taught traditional positional gunnery. They'd practiced on ranges where tanks moved to firing positions, halted, engaged pop-up targets, then moved to the next position. The stabilizer featured in this training as a device that kept the gun roughly aimed during the movement phase. When these crews reached frontline units in France, veteran tank commanders had to retrain them. The unofficial curriculum emphasized different skills: tracking targets while moving, judging range under dynamic conditions, understanding terrain from a shooter's perspective, maintaining speed while shooting. New crews learned quickly or died quickly. The battlefield was a brutal instructor. The German army began noticing that American tank tactics were changing during late 1944, but their intelligence analysis struggled to characterize what was happening. German after-action reports noted that American Shermans were increasingly engaging while advancing, that they seemed less concerned with establishing firing positions before shooting, that they were closing to shorter ranges more aggressively. German tactical responses were constrained by their own equipment limitations. The Panther and Tiger tanks that equipped German armored formations had superior guns and armor compared to Shermans, but they lacked stabilization systems. German tank gunnery was entirely positional. Their doctrine emphasized the ambush, the prepared position, the long-range engagement where superior German guns could penetrate Sherman armor before the Americans closed to effective range. This doctrine had worked extremely well earlier in the war, but it assumed American tanks would cooperate by fighting according to American doctrine, which meant maneuvering to positions and then halting to shoot. When American tanks started advancing continuously while firing, the German tactical framework struggled to adapt. German gunners were trained to engage stationary or slow-moving targets. Tracking a Sherman doing 20 miles per hour while taking return fire from that Sherman was a different gunnery problem. The Germans tried several counter-tactics. They attempted to engage at even longer ranges, hoping to destroy advancing Shermans before they closed to where their moving gunnery became effective. This worked sometimes, but required excellent initial target acquisition, which was difficult when multiple Shermans were advancing on different axes. They tried concentrating fire on lead tanks, hoping to create wreckage obstacles that would force following tanks to halt. This also worked occasionally, but required precise execution under pressure. What the Germans couldn't do was match the American capability. They didn't have stabilizers. Their tank designs emphasized static gunnery performance, not dynamic fire control. Some German tank commanders recognized that American tactics were exploiting a technical advantage German armor simply didn't possess. But recognizing a problem and solving it are different challenges. By late 1944, Germany lacked the industrial capacity to redesign their tanks around new fire control systems, even if they'd wanted to. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 provided a large-scale test of moving gunnery tactics under the worst possible conditions. German armored spearheads attacking through the Ardennes initially achieved surprise and local superiority. American tank units found themselves heavily outnumbered, fighting in snow, fog, and freezing. temperatures that stressed both men and equipment. The 4th Armoured Division's relief of Bastogne illustrated how moving gunnery tactics functioned in desperate circumstances. Abrams' battalion led the advance toward the encircled town, facing prepared German defences in depth. Traditional doctrine would have called for a methodical advance with tanks moving from position to position, halting to engage each defensive line before advancing to the next. Abrams didn't do that. His tanks advanced continuously on December 26th, shooting on the move, forcing German defenders to respond to a moving threat. The stabilizers whined, the guns roared, and the Shermans closed the distance to Bastogne faster than German commanders thought possible. When observers asked how Abrams' battalion broke through in 5 hours, what was expected to take a day or more, the answer came down to sustained movement under fire. Not every unit could execute moving gunnery as effectively as Abrams' battalion. It required trained crews, maintained equipment, aggressive leadership, and suitable terrain. But enough units across Third Army and other formations had adopted elements of the tactic that the aggregate effect was significant. American tank battalions in late 1944 fought differently than they had in June. They were more aggressive, more willing to close range, more comfortable shooting while moving. The casualty statistics reflected this doctrinal evolution. Tank crew loss rates in Third Army peaked during the Normandy fighting, when American armor was still trying to fight according to pre-war positional doctrine against an enemy optimized to defeat that exact approach. Loss rates declined significantly during the autumn advance across France, even though American forces were advancing into prepared German defenses. Part of this improvement came from air superiority, artillery support, and numerical advantages. But detailed analysis of engagement reports showed that tank versus tank combat outcomes improved markedly. Sherman crews were destroying German armor at better ratios and suffering fewer losses themselves. The tactical innovation of moving gunnery contributed substantially to this improvement. By January 1945, moving gunnery had become standard practice in most experienced American tank units, though it remained largely undocumented in official doctrine. Replacement crews arriving from the United States still learned positional gunnery in training, then had to be retaught by their units in combat. This disconnect between training and practice created inefficiencies, but the combat units couldn't wait for official doctrine to catch up with battlefield reality. The technical understanding of why moving gunnery worked took longer to develop. During the war, most explanations focused on the stabilizer's capability to maintain gun alignment while moving. This was accurate but incomplete. The full picture was more complex and involved multiple factors interacting in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The stabilizer's vertical compensation was the enabling technology, but its effectiveness depended on several other Sherman characteristics. The tank's relatively soft suspension helped smooth out terrain irregularities, reducing the magnitude of vertical movement the stabilizer had to correct. The power traverse system allowed rapid turret rotation to track moving targets or respond to threats from multiple directions. The gun's modest recoil and quick reload time meant crews could fire multiple shots in quick succession, compensating for reduced first shot hit probability through volume of fire. The Sherman's armor profile also played a role, though this wasn't recognized until post-war analysis. The tank's frontal armor, while inferior to German heavy tanks in absolute thickness, was sloped in ways that made it more effective when the tank was moving at an angle to enemy fire. Traditional positional gunnery often presented the Sherman's front directly to enemy guns. Moving gunnery, especially when advancing at angles, presented a more complex ballistic problem for enemy gunners. The tactical doctrine that evolved around moving gunnery exploited these characteristics systematically. Tank commanders learned to advance on multiple axes, forcing enemy gunners to divide attention. They coordinated movement with suppressive fire, keeping enemy crews buttoned up and degrading their target acquisition. They used terrain to mask their advance, popping into enemy sight lines only when already at speed and with guns aligned. This represented combined arms thinking applied at the individual tank level. The tank itself became a combined arms system, mobility, firepower, and protection, working together in dynamic relationship rather than as separate attributes. The crew's job wasn't to find the best position to shoot from. It was to create a continuous sequence of acceptable firing opportunities while minimizing their own vulnerability through movement. The German perspective on these tactics appeared in interrogation reports from captured tank crews during early 1945. German tankers described American Shermans as unexpectedly aggressive, advancing while firing in ways that disrupted German engagement procedures. Several prisoners noted that their training had prepared them to fight tanks that maneuvered to positions and then fought from those positions. American tanks that shot continuously while advancing presented problems their doctrine didn't address effectively. One Panther commander captured near the Rhine in March 1945 described an engagement where his tank was in an excellent hull-down position with clear fields of fire. He'd destroyed 2 Shermans that attempted to cross open ground toward his position, hitting both with first shots while they were moving. Then 3 more Shermans appeared from different directions, all advancing at speed, all firing. His gunner couldn't decide which tank to engage first, couldn't track multiple moving targets simultaneously, and took hits from 2 directions before he could respond effectively. The Panther survived but had to abandon position. The commander's assessment was that American tactics had become more sophisticated, more complex, harder to counter. This assessment was accurate. American tank tactics in 1945 bore little resemblance to American tactics in 1942. The evolution had happened largely from the bottom up, driven by combat commanders seeking solutions to tactical problems, enabled by equipment capabilities that official doctrine had failed to recognize or exploit. The stabilizer had been designed as an aiming aid. Combat commanders discovered it could be a fire control system. That discovery changed how American armor fought. The official recognition of moving gunnery as a primary tactic came too late to affect World War II doctrine significantly. By the time training establishments and technical writing staffs began incorporating the lessons into formal documents, the war in Europe was ending. The summer 1945 training manuals that would have codified the new approach were overtaken by events. Victory rendered them obsolete before they reached armored schools, but the institutional knowledge persisted through the veterans who'd developed and practiced moving gunnery tactics. When the United States rebuilt its armored forces during the late 1940s and early 1950s, many of the officers filling command and training positions had combat experience in Europe. They brought with them understanding that stabilized gunnery while moving wasn't just possible but could be the primary engagement method. Creighton Abrams himself became head of the tactics department at the Armored School at Fort Knox in 1946. In that position, he directly influenced how the next generation of American tankers would be trained. The lessons he'd learned near Arracourt, the techniques his battalion had developed through trial and error, became formal doctrine. The stabilizer was no longer taught as merely an aiming aid. It was taught as a fire control system that enabled an entirely different way of fighting. The Korean War validated these doctrinal changes. American tanks in Korea routinely fired on the move, using their stabilizers to maintain aim while advancing or withdrawing. The tactic proved effective against North Korean and Chinese armor, which lacked comparable fire control systems. American tank crews that had been trained in the new doctrine performed markedly better than crews trained in traditional positional gunnery. By the time the M60 tank entered service in the 1960s, stabilization was fully integrated into American armored doctrine at every level. The M60's stabilizer was more sophisticated than the Sherman's wartime system, providing compensation in both elevation and traverse. But the tactical concept remained the same. The tank fought while moving, using its fire control system to deliver accurate fire under dynamic conditions. The M1 Abrams tank, introduced in the 1980s and named for Creighton Abrams, represented the full realization of the moving gunnery concept. Its stabilization and fire control systems allowed accurate fire while traveling at speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour across rough terrain. The doctrine that enabled this capability traced directly back to autumn 1944, when frustrated tank commanders in France discovered that their equipment could do things their training said were impossible. The gap between official doctrine and equipment capability persisted for less than a year in World War II. But that year saw American tanks transition from fighting according to World War I artillery principles to fighting according to principles that would define armored warfare for the next half-century. The innovation didn't come from procurement offices or technical development centers. It came from combat commanders who recognized that survival required using their tanks differently than the manuals specified. The Sherman stabilizer was never a revolutionary technology in itself. Similar systems existed in prototype form in other countries. The Soviets experimented with stabilization in the late 1930s. The British understood the concept. What made the American implementation significant wasn't the hardware. It was the combination of adequate hardware and a military culture that, at the battalion level, was willing to ignore doctrine when doctrine was getting people killed. This cultural characteristic was arguably more important than any technical advantage. German tanks had superior guns and armor. Soviet tanks had superior mobility. But American tankers had permission, explicit or implicit, to figure out what worked and do it, even if it contradicted what they'd been taught. That institutional flexibility, that willingness to let combat experience drive tactical innovation, was the Sherman's real advantage. The specific innovation of moving gunnery emerged from that flexibility. Abrams and commanders like him weren't following secret orders or executing a planned doctrinal shift. They were solving problems with the tools they had, discovering that those tools could be used in ways the designers hadn't necessarily intended. The stabilizer was designed to reduce halt to fire time. It turned out to be capable of eliminating the halt entirely. The German failure to develop comparable capabilities wasn't primarily a technical failure. Germany had excellent engineers and sophisticated armament industries. They could have developed stabilization systems if they'd recognized the operational requirement, but German doctrine didn't generate that requirement. Their tanks were designed around static gunnery, ambush tactics, prepared positions. Those methods worked well enough, early enough, that institutional pressure to develop alternatives didn't materialize until too late. By the time German commanders recognized that American moving gunnery presented a problem their doctrine couldn't counter effectively, Germany lacked the industrial capacity and time to redesign their tanks. They were fighting a defensive war with dwindling resources against enemies who owned the air and had material superiority. Addressing fire control system inadequacies wasn't possible, even if it had been recognized as necessary. The Soviets took a different path. They studied American stabilization systems, received some Sherman tanks through Lend-Lease, and noted the technical approach. Soviet tank design philosophy emphasized different priorities than American design, but they recognized the value of stabilized fire control. The T-54, introduced in the late 1940s, incorporated a basic stabilization system. Subsequent Soviet tanks expanded this capability, eventually matching and in some areas exceeding Western fire control technology. The British also absorbed the lessons, but initially moved away from stabilization in their post-war tank designs. The Centurion tank, entering service in 1945, featured a sophisticated stabilization system. But Britain's reduced defense budgets and strategic reorientation after the war meant fewer resources for armored forces. British armor doctrine also shifted toward different priorities. The moving gunnery innovations developed by American crews in France didn't transfer completely to British practice. The specific tactical innovation that began near Arracourt in September 1944 ultimately influenced armored warfare globally. But the path of that influence was indirect and took decades to fully develop. The immediate effect was on American armor doctrine and training. The long-term effect was on how all modern tanks approached the fundamental problem of delivering accurate fire from a moving platform. Modern main battle tanks from multiple nations incorporate fire control systems descended conceptually from the Sherman's gyrostabilizer. The technology is far more sophisticated, using computers, laser rangefinders, and complex ballistic algorithms, but the operational concept remains the same. The tank fights while moving, using its fire control system to compensate for motion and deliver hits against targets that may themselves be moving. That operational concept traces directly to the combat commanders who, during the final year of World War II in Europe, discovered that their tanks could do something their doctrine said was impossible: They could shoot accurately while moving at combat speeds, and doing so gave them a tactical advantage that changed engagement outcomes, reduced friendly casualties, and ultimately contributed to victory. The story of moving gunnery tactics isn't primarily a story of technology, though technology enabled it. It's a story of tactical innovation under pressure, of combat commanders willing to discard doctrine when doctrine was failing, of crews willing to practice difficult skills that weren't in any manual. The Sherman stabilizer was the tool. The innovation was recognizing what that tool could actually do and building tactics around that recognition rather than around pre-war assumptions. Creighton Abrams' engagement on September 20th, 1944, represented a turning point in that process. It wasn't the first time a Sherman fired on the move. It wasn't the first time moving gunnery achieved a tactical success. But it was among the first times a senior commander deliberately adopted moving gunnery as a primary tactic, demonstrated its effectiveness, and then advocated for its adoption across his formation. The ripple effects from that decision spread through Third Army, then through other armies, then into doctrine, then into training, then into post-war tank design. The M1 Abrams tank, named for the man who proved the concept in combat, represents the culmination of a doctrinal evolution that began with frustrated tank commanders in France trying to keep their crews alive against superior German guns. The numbers tell the story most clearly. American tank battalions in Normandy during June and July 1944 suffered casualty rates that would have been unsustainable in a longer campaign. Those same units, by December 1944, were achieving favorable kill ratios against better-equipped German formations. The tactical innovation of moving gunnery contributed substantially to that reversal. Crews that had been taught to halt and aim learned instead to advance and shoot. The doctrine that emerged from that learning changed armored warfare permanently. The pilots who learned to pull out late, the fighter pilots who learned to fly inverted, and the tank commanders who learned to fire on the move shared a common experience. They discovered that survival required violating the doctrine they'd been taught. In each case, the equipment was capable of things doctrine said were impossible. In each case, combat commanders recognized those capabilities and built new tactics around them. In each case, the institutional military eventually caught up and codified the innovations. But the innovations came first from the edge, from the people actually fighting, from the men who couldn't afford to wait for doctrine to change because they needed solutions immediately. That pattern of tactical innovation driven by operational necessity rather than institutional direction characterized American military practice throughout World War II. It was one of the United States' genuine advantages in the war, perhaps more significant than industrial capacity or numerical superiority. The tank commanders who learned to fire on the move and crushed Panzers at 25 miles per hour weren't following orders. They were solving problems with the tools they had, discovering capabilities those tools possessed that their training had never mentioned. The Sherman's gyrostabilizer was designed to do one thing. Combat commanders discovered it could do something else, something more important. That discovery changed how tanks fight. 7 decades later, every modern main battle tank inherits that legacy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.